History is created in the moment. What is breaking news is quickly eroded by the next scandal. But no scandal in the past year has been able to erode the causes and effects of a global pandemic. When COVID-19 was first announced in January 2020, many hoped it would never make it to sweet St Lucia. But it did. And like every other country in the world, it rearranged our economy. It showed the ignorance of our people. It embellished the greed of politicians for wanton political power. It showed how not even the wealthiest of nations could survive a pandemic on its own. It also showed how gullible people, fueled by cheap political motives, can ignore life-saving measures in support of a political ideology. It also exemplified the hard-working St. Lucians in every sector who stepped up their game, who adapted, who placed their lives at risk daily to provide care, security, food and transportation for a nation in a perpetual state of medical panic. This documentary recaps from the very first case of COVID-19 in the world to the vaccination of nearly 25,000 St. Lucians. It recounts what Alan Chastanet and his government did and failed to do. And it homes in on the opposition and their contribution in the ongoing fight between St. Lucia versus COVID-19. Everyone knows someone who has either contracted COVID-19 or been quarantined due to exposure. Everyone has been impacted either by way of employment, loss of income, accessing education, public and private service, grocery shopping, or getting a haircut. This is the new normal. But how did we get here? Who or what was responsible for the exponential rise in the number of cases? Was it a lack of government action, world events, deficiencies in public education, a Ministry of Health dropping the ball? Or perhaps it was the actions or inactions of our citizens? Or did the Prime Minister and his cabinet fiddle while St. Lucia burned? Whatever the reasons, the Chinese writing was on the wall since December 2019.
Millions of people are being tested multiple times, and millions have been locked down. This man left his house for a walk and was verbally abused and tied to a tree for his trouble.
Wuhan Municipal Health Commission in China reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia in Hubei province.
In other news, China has confirmed 4 additional cases of the coronavirus outbreak affecting the country.
These places are going to remain shut until further notice because the authorities here are anxious to try to further contain the spread of this virus. So far,
the virus had been linked to respiratory tract infections and illnesses ranging from the common cold to more acute conditions such as Middle East respiratory syndrome and severe acute respiratory syndrome.
A mysterious pneumonia has gripped China, with scores hospitalized by the illness. In the central Chinese city of Wuhan, 59 people were reportedly hospitalized, with 7 people in a serious condition.
The signs of infection included fever, cough, shortness of breath, and difficulty breathing.
When the coronavirus attaches to a cell, it begins to replicate within the cell. The body's immune system.
In the severe cases of the virus, pneumonia may cause respiratory distress and death. Initial evidence suggested that person-to-person transmission was limited, but little did we know. By January 21st, the virus was characterized as highly contagious and had spread to at least 10 other countries outside China. Deeply concerned by the alarming levels of spread and severity, the World Health Organization constituted the outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern, and later, a pandemic.
That COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
Although the risk level for the Caribbean sub-region was classified as low, the government of St. Lucia, through the Department of Health and Wellness, felt it prudent to update its existing influenza preparedness plans to reduce the inevitable impact on our population.
And some of the activities that we have been working on includes, but not limited to, the education and sensitization of our health workers, non-health stakeholders and the general public, the enhancement of our port health services, active surveillance at high-risk institutions, prompt recognition strategies, measures to ensure isolation of ill cases in designated hospital isolation wards, establishing diagnostic capacity, working with the Caribbean Public Health Agency, contact tracing and quarantine of suspect cases, and the promotion of general hygiene measures and infection control for border agency, healthcare professional, and the general public.
Due to an increased risk of importation of COVID-19 to the region, the Caribbean Public Health Agency upgraded the risk of coronavirus transmission from low to moderate to high. On March 1, 2020, Prime Minister Alan Chasney and the Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sharon Belmar George attended a special meeting of CARICOM in Barbados to discuss the global threat of COVID-19 to the region and facilitate regional coordination for the management of the virus. After this meeting came a shift in mindset from preparedness to readiness, and rapid response was necessary to strengthen our country's capacity to handle possible importation of cases. By March 1st, the virus has spread to 68 countries and total global mortality stood at 3,041. China was the most affected country. St Lucia actively monitored and waited for the inevitable.
Public health officials have confirmed that 4 individuals are under quarantine in St Lucia amid the outbreak of the Wuhan.
Multiple stakeholder training and engagement sessions were conducted to prepare for the foreseeable. St Lucia Air and Seaports Authority, first responders and border control began extensive training under the guidance of the CMO. Travel restrictions from China and the return of St. Lucian students from that country triggered a series of false alarms and the malicious spread of inaccurate information designed to create mass panic. The Dominican Republic was first, quickly followed by St. Martin, St. Barthélemy, and then our French-speaking neighbors to the north. March 7th, 2020, our greatest fears landed at the Euronora International Airport, carrying a British passport.
The patient arrived in St. Lucia on March 7th in the company of her husband and presented to our healthcare system on March 11th, 2020. A clinical sample was taken from the patient on that same day and was sent to the Caribbean Public Health Agency for testing. The results were received today, Friday, March 13th, this afternoon, and confirmed that it is our first case of COVID-19 here in St. Lucia.
By March 16th, following the confirmation of the second case of COVID-19 in St. Lucia, the National Emergency Management Advisory Committee, NEMAC, held a meeting with stakeholders to outline plans and receive feedback and recommendations to counter the global pandemic. The meeting came amidst the closure of schools and extension of travel bans to mitigate transmission. Very early, the leader of the opposition assured the leader of government business of his party's support in whatever measures which could be undertaken to bring relief to citizens in the wake of the potential economic fallout from in-country transmission.
And our party will support government and parliament if it comes to changing existing rules or legislation to support these kind of initiatives.
On March 17th, Alan Chasney, flanked by his cabinet, made the first of what would become regular public statements. The inaugural address was to announce measures which had been instituted to mitigate against in-country transmission. Shortly after, a state of emergency was declared from March 23rd to April 5th. The suspension of non-essential commercial activities, cancellation of all mass crowd events, a curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m., and closure of the country's airports. Despite these measures, by March 31st, 2020, St Lucia had recorded 13 cases, 6 returning nationals, 5 residents, and 2 visitors. As a result, the country was shut down, with all persons confined to their homes on a 24-hour mandatory curfew. Discontentment, fear, and anxiety soon consumed the hearts and minds of citizens. Despite the best intention of the leader of government business, the critics were unrelenting. His actions, though guided by the World Health Organization requirements, regional consensus, and backed by the advice of our medical experts, nothing seemed to quell the anxiety, loss of income, restrictions in movement, and uncertainty of the future, which was wreaking havoc, not only in St Lucia, but in every other country in the Caribbean and the world. Alan Chasney was a man under pressure. Coming up, a character is arrested, another character apologizes, and Joachim Henry does some mathematics. In response, the government of St Lucia loosened the reins in a partial shutdown, allowing supermarkets, mini-marts and bakeries to reopen for a limited time. A 10-hour curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. was implemented, permitting essential businesses to operate, including hardware and home supply stores. Meanwhile, Minister for External Affairs Sarah Flood-Bobra made arrangements to have thousands of St. Lucians employed on various cruise vessels around the world repatriated.
We have a total number of 219 cruise ship workers who are now making their way to St. Lucia. I'm sure families out there will be very, very relieved to hear that.
Just entering Port Castries there, finally touching the land there,
Finally, they're home, and I think this is the best thing for now. I think the government has been doing a great job, because in other countries they have to pay for coming back home, whereas St. Lucia, they get free hotel, free food, free medical. I think it is well, the government is doing well. I applaud them for that.
On March 13th, she was the bearer of bad news. But on April 21st, the CMO returned to the media announcing that St. Lucia had achieved a clean bill of health.
Our last confirmed case was reported on Friday, April 10th, 2020, and since then, of the 58 tests run, all have been negative for COVID-19.
Between the announcement of the first case until April 21st, the government employed all resources in a multifaceted matrix to configure a medical puzzle which was still only in its infancy. And the challenges were thick and complex. Yet the responses all seemed to be backed by science, proactive governance, and the preservation of life and livelihoods. For example, the island had to deal with a mass entry of St. Lucians returning home, and it had to provide accommodation for said persons for 14 days, all expenses paid while in quarantine.
Part of the protocol that we went through, but it was good. We enjoyed.
In the beginning it was a little difficult until we settled in. After we settled in, it was really comfortable. The nurses, everybody made it really comfortable for us.
I had a good experience in quarantine, but thanks to the Ministry of Health, the Prime Minister, the officers, the nurses, which made it a tremendous experience. So I want to give them a thumbs up and to tell them keep what they were doing.
The experience here has been pretty positive, I'd like to say. I was able to get a lot of my schoolwork done. Got 3 meals a day, which was quite nice. I liked the rigorous checks that they did for our temperature every single morning and every night. So overall, I think it was a very useful experience.
Within a 2-month period, the government had paid over $4,611,423.19 in quarantine-related charges.
We purchased the Q32 as a form of increase in our diagnostic capacity for COVID-19.
By March 23rd, We had the capacity to do local testing long before our regional neighbors.
We have a point of view that we make known to the public because it's our responsibility as an opposition to make that point of view be heard.
March 24th saw the unprecedented show of bipartisanship as the usual disorderly conduct of the members of the House gave way to consensus on the state of emergency.
Although we may not be in support or we may not be in agreement, we are not going to engage in a political fight with the government. We are giving the government all the space needed.
I'm very pleased to announce tonight that the Minister of Health and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, along with the Cuban ambassador here, have been able to facilitate getting over 100 Cuban doctors and nurses to be able to come to St Lucia.
March 25th, the Marine Unit got an injection in resources to conduct 24-hour patrols of our porous borders. Carnival 2020 became a COVID casualty, and understandably so.
If the October date doesn't work, then that's the end of it for this year, and we will have to look at it for next year.
What I could tell you is it's not going to be business as usual. For sure, it's not going to be business as usual. The same things we used to see around Carnival, that's not going to be for sure.
The month of March saw a complete restructuring of our healthcare offerings. Respiratory clinics were set up across the island, allowing persons experiencing flu-like symptoms to get free care at the Grosley Polyclinic, the Leclerc Wellness Center, the Dennery and Soufriere Hospital, and the Viewfort Wellness Center, as well as a dedicated 311 hotline for information. In the midst of the shutdown, strategic action was taken to bring relief to thousands. There was a comprehensive approach to cross the political lines to assist citizens in need, and over 10,000 care packages were delivered. And throughout all of these efforts, the critics never assisted. Instead, they did what critics do best. Prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, the St. Lucian economy was projected to continue along its growth path that had been ongoing since 2016. The economy was forecasted to grow at around 3.2% in 2020, building on the previous 4 years of growth, supported by solid tourism and tourism-related construction. Since confirming the island's first case of COVID-19 on March 13th, the government implemented a state of emergency, closed its borders, and instituted a series of curfews to contain the spread.
We've assessed the information received and arrived at the following specific immediate decisions to protect the health and security of our nation.
These pragmatic actions were successful in containing the virus and ensuring that the health impacts were arguably minimal, with just 19 cases and no fatalities as at June 4th. However, our preemptive actions locally had a dual impact of decimating our economy, especially our tourism industry, with spill-off effects in other sectors. Conscious of the economic fallout, on April 8th, the Alan Chasney administration announced that a social stabilization program was developed to aid people who had become unemployed as a result of the corona pandemic, providing them with both a financial stipend and monthly food hampers. An economic support package was also developed to assist affected small businesses.
Well, I'm very happy because right now I had nothing for 6 months, so I get the check, I'm happy.
It's very nice. It was a pleasure helping us, the government and different vibe. I like the vibe, how it's going. Thanks a lot, man, for the support,
My provisions for me to sell back, to do my vending.
The economy was hit hard indirectly by major contractions in stayover arrivals from the United States and UK due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The preliminary data indicated a decline in tourist arrivals by 50% in 2020 due to global travel restrictions. Consequently, the standstill in tourism resulted in a GDP contraction of 9 to 15%, a surge in debt by 12% in 2020 due to additional expenditure, and approximately 45% of the labor force lost their jobs. The immediate impact of the pandemic on the construction sector was significant due to a high reliance on tourism investment and public sector capital expenditure. The implementation of social distancing protocols, coupled with travel restrictions and the redeployment of capital to address a public health emergency, brought non-essential construction in the country to a complete halt, resulting in hundreds of jobs and income loss. But travel restrictions on commuter buses would cause the greatest stir.
So what we have done is limited the use of these buses to 3 persons in the back seat, and each of the other rows of seats in the vehicle would have 2 passengers per row, so that it would help to reduce the close proximity in which people sit and would help us to enforce the social distancing that we require.
Some bus drivers insisted that COVID protocols should not pertain to public buses because it affected their profitability.
It's very bad. After we have done the day with 7 passengers, it's just for gas we are working. After our day, just about $20 we have left after our day's work.
Some associations even staged protest action to ensure their buses were packed to capacity despite community spread.
We decide we're going to pull off our service until when we get a sit-in with the powers that be. I'm talking about the Prime Minister, the Minister of Transport, along with the CMO.
St Lucia approached the COVID-19 response with a 3-pronged approach. Phase 1, the public health response, which included strengthening the public healthcare system, border closures, curfews, state of emergency, and school closures. These measures were successful in keeping community spread to a minimum and ensuring 100% recovery on numerous occasions. Phase 2 was the Social Stabilization Plan, which was launched on April 29th and included income support of between $500 and $1,500 per month through the National Insurance Corporation for contributors and non-contributors for an initial period of 3 months. About 18,000 persons out of a working population of approximately 75,000 benefited from this initiative.
At this point in time, it's very challenging and it's very difficult for a lot of people around the island. And you have some houses in instances where both the mother and the father are now out of a job. And we believe that it's very important to ensure that at least they can have food for the week.
The government of St. Lucia provided direct support by way of distribution of over 10,500 food and supply care packages and over 2,500 hot meals on a weekly basis to vulnerable households.
Prime Minister Alan Chasley, who called into Radio 100's Out Goes In on April 9th, did indicate that the NIC is not authorized to make such payments unless the laws are revised.
NIC currently is not configured to be able to give income support. So NIC only pays persons who are on sick leave. And so we've made an amendment to allow NIC to be able to give this income support. But I think the day is coming that we need to expand NIC not only to cover healthcare insurance, but also to cover income insurance.
Coming up, Sean Edwards speaks the truth. Sean Edwards speaks the truth again. And Philip Pierre is livid. The government worked in collaboration with the utility companies, banking and other financial institutions to create the best support packages to the different sectors of the society. These included a moratorium on bank mortgage repayments for both individuals and entities for a period of 6 months through September. Suspension of all rent payments for 6 months for those occupying government-owned commercial units. provision of direct support to farmers to sustain their livelihoods. The government developed a strong buy local campaign which was geared towards reducing our importation bill, facilitating diversification, spurring investment in local enterprise, fostering greater consumption, and assisting in generating some levels of employment. Phase 3 included the Economic Recovery and Resilience Plan, geared at providing support to the business sector through credit and liquidity support, as well as supporting poor and vulnerable households. The Prime Minister allotted 5.1 million EC dollars in tangible benefits towards poor and vulnerable citizens who had been affected by COVID-19, as well as hotel and tourism employees who were currently unemployed. These benefits included an expansion of the number of poor households on St. Lucia's Public Assistance Program by an additional 1,000 households, an increase in the cash transfer to the over 280 households receiving child disability grants from $200 to $300 monthly, and a similar top-up to the 183 households receiving foster care grants, while the person living with HIV grant was increased to $200. The government also provided personal protective equipment and COVID-19 hygiene care packages to the indigent and vulnerable.
The fuel surcharge of $1 will be reduced by 50 cents for a 6-month period. This is expected to generate savings which will be used to reduce the electricity bills of qualifying households between $50 and $100 per month.
The government of St. Lucia provided concessions to companies which produce sanitation, healthcare, and medical-related products, an extension of corporate tax installation payments, extension of time for filing of income tax returns by 1 month, tax credits to companies and other entities which retained at least 30% of their staff, and a temporary waiver of interest and penalties on all tax types for March 2020. St. Lucia also secured the IMF Rapid Credit Facility of US $29 million, amongst others, to support its COVID-19 response initiatives. The Ministry of Education established partnerships with telecommunication providers to bridge the digital divide between students of different means. Furthermore, the Ministry of Education began procuring new equipment to support remote learning and started adopting the use of learning management systems to better support virtual classrooms. This was a paradigm shift for the education sector. Phase 4, which commenced in early June, saw the launch of a large stimulus to the private sector. The government provided $5 million to otherwise solvent businesses with low-cost financing between 4 and 5% interest to assist in meeting their working capital objectives.
The St. Lucia Development Bank, through its partnership with the DVRP, was able to have the World Bank and its partners, the Climate Investment Fund, repurpose the climate adaptation financing facility. And not that it's going to move away strictly from its core mandate, which was looking at making St. Lucians, their households, their businesses more resilient to the climate, but it now takes into consideration the impact of COVID.
In mitigating the possible spread of COVID-19 into our communities, the following tourism-related health and safety protocols must be observed during the deployment of taxi and rideshare.
Phase 5, which was implemented in mid-July, saw the gradual reopening of our borders to tourists with required protocols in place. St. Lucia's coronavirus strategy during this phase was designed to jumpstart the economy while protecting locals and visitors through advanced coronavirus testing, daily screening, and monitoring of staff and visitors.
A new timeline has been identified to welcome visitors to St. Lucia's shores.
As far as I know, we have decided to open on the 9th of July.
By mid-July, the government had accommodated a total of 2,261 individuals at its public health facilities, including repeat travelers. Government's expenditure for the national COVID-19 response to date tallied at over $10 million. On Wednesday, April 29th, Prime Minister Alan Chastanet presented a $1.7 billion budget. The record estimates came against the backdrop of a world marred in economic uncertainty.
So just last night, Mr. Speaker, the IMF board agreed to lend St Lucia $30 million US. We were among two other countries, Grenada and Dominica. And I want to really congratulate and thank the Director of Finance and her team for the extraordinary efforts that they have put in.
Despite the gloomy outlook, Prime Minister Alan Chastanet tabled key initiatives for economic stability and implementation of projects to get St. Lucia back to work. The art of political opposition is spinning the truth sufficiently in an effort to convince undecided voters that the government of the day is deliberately mismanaging the finances of a country. Figures which show decline are touted as proof of malmanagement and recklessness, whereas the circumstances which led to the decline are deliberately never mentioned, like a pandemic raging havoc on the world.
Presenting a 2021 budget with such a huge deficit of $560 million, the Prime Minister is finally admitting that the government has failed to manage the economy effectively and does not have a clue how to address the current economic situation.
In reality, government revenue the world over had been impacted by COVID-19. St. Lucia moved from 219,608 stayover arrivals between January to June 2019 to 91,399 for the same period in 2020. The arrival figures declined by 58%. Government revenue as received in the consolidated funds moved from 641 million EC dollars in January to June 2019 to 491 million for the same period in 2020, whereas the expense of government in the same period increased to 641 million in 2020 from 608 million in 2019. The majority of these increases were due to social stabilization programs, the supply of respiratory masks for the treatment of COVID-19 patients, the purchase of reagents for testing, the supply of personal protective equipment, airfares, lodging and accommodation for the Cuban Medical Brigade, boarding and lodging of persons in quarantine and isolation centers, retrofitting of the Victoria Hospital for conversion to a respiratory hospital, retrofitting of other medical facilities, and refurbishment of the arrivals hall at the airports. Other significant direct procurement activities included water tanks, acquired to assist with water storage for increased sanitation, and computers and equipment to facilitate the e-learning of students across the island. When we return in this Untold Stories Super Special, an airport reopens, a patient dies, a protest ensues, and the nightmare begins. In April 2020, 4 St. Lucians contracted COVID-19. All recovered. In May, there was only 1 case.
With the death toll rising above 279,000, the global number of COVID-19 cases has surpassed 4 million.
Around the world, the virus was rearranging economies, testing every healthcare system, and it was just warming up. May 2nd, Moscow's mayor announced that 2% of the city's population tested positive for the coronavirus. May 3rd, in the United States, Virginia reports its first corona death. Total deaths in the United States as of that date was 65,464. By May 5th, the number of cases globally surpassed 3.5 million, but just 5 days later, it hit 4 million.
I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine. Right now, yeah.
During a roundtable with restaurant executives, the president revealed he's been taking the drug hydroxychloroquine along with zinc for nearly 2 weeks to try and prevent the coronavirus.
May 18th, Donald Trump announced he was taking hydroxychloroquine.
A new study suggests hydroxychloroquine, which President Donald Trump has endorsed as a potential treatment for COVID-19, does not benefit coronavirus patients who received it. In fact, researchers say patients who were given the drug died more often than those who were not.
In June 2020, a sense of calm was returning to the streets. Our borders were closed to regional and international flights, except for the occasional Boeing 737 with returning nationals. Social distancing, the wearing of masks, and the constant spraying of hands with sanitizer at every possible opportunity were factors that led to just one case slipping through with a returning national. It was a good month for the health sector, the government, and the people.
Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sharon Belmar George has been a staunch defender of the continuation of the state of emergency.
July was another good month for the health sector. 5 returning nationals brought COVID back home as souvenirs, and 1 local was infected. There were no fatalities and everyone recovered. St Lucia closed its borders to international markets on March 23, 2020, and implemented a series of protocols recommended by the World Health Organization and the Caribbean Public Health Agency in collaboration with the local Ministry of Health and Wellness. These measures were proven successful. From March 13th to June 30th, St. Lucia had recorded 19 cases of the virus, and all patients fully recovered, with no active cases under investigation. With the virus seemingly under control, a COVID-19 task force was created with the responsibility of reopening the borders with a phased approach. On July 9, 2020, under a host of strict protocols including a negative COVID-19 test result 7 days before travel and quarantining for 14 days, St. Lucia welcomed its first commercial flight.
American Airlines Flight 2295 from Miami International Airport landed at 2:15 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time.
After 3 months of opening the borders and welcoming nearly 6,000 guests to its shores, St. Lucia continued to be a model in the fight against COVID-19. Our little island received a level 1 rating from the Center for Disease Control, being one in only 8 countries globally to achieve this.
What we are doing here is to examine our protocols. We are testing all of the management mechanisms we've put in place to ensure that we can coexist with COVID.
As part of its phased reopening, the Uranora International Airport accommodated flights from the United States only. A total of 1,500 hotel rooms across 18 COVID-19 certified hotels were made ready to receive guests. Limitations were placed on traditional excursions such as sightseeing and diving, and hotel and travel providers were tasked with arranging safe experiences for guests. The government of St. Lucia, through the Caribcation brand, introduced its extended stay program as part of Phase 2's reopening. As such, more water-based activities were permitted, including diving and snorkeling. Tourism Minister Dominic Fede outlined measures to open additional attractions and restaurants so as to boost foreign exchange circulation within the economy. Phase 2 also permitted flights from the UK and Canada after nearly 8 months of no service. The Level 1 rating by the CDC and the easing of restrictions allowed St. Lucians to achieve a state of normalcy in their daily lives for a while. The Ministry of Commerce permitted businesses to resume full operations during normal business hours, and thousands returned to work. Curfews were relaxed from an 8-hour period to 5 hours, running from 12 a.m. to 5 a.m. Social gatherings of up to 50 persons were allowed, though mass crowd events were still prohibited. Liquor licenses were reinstated, allowing many entertainment centers and bars to resume operation, and the creative arts was back on stream. As proof of the effectiveness of the COVID-19 guidelines, St. Lucia attained 100% recovery by August 16, 2020. This utopic existence within a global pandemic continued through the month of September, allowing all schools to reopen.
We had a smooth opening, and it's mostly because the parents were involved from the time we began preparing to come back to school.
The government of St. Lucia implemented a COVID-19 prevention and control bill in October 2020. It was designed to regulate the containment of the spread of the virus and maintain public order.
And Mr. Speaker, job number one for us was to make sure that nobody died. That was an aspiration.
Section 1 focused on the establishment of a command center whose function was to serve as an advisory body to Cabinet on matters relating to COVID-19 and have oversight of the activities required to reduce or prevent the spread of the virus. These activities included the suspension of liquor licenses, mass crowd events and assembly, and the implementation of curfews. Section 2 pertained to COVID-19 rules regulating the wearing of masks, physical distancing, temperature screening, and business operating hours. Section 3 spoke of tourism services, such as hotels and shops, to obtain a COVID-19 compliance certificate which outlined their ability to successfully meet protocol standards for the protection of staff and locals. Section 4 pertained to travel requirements for persons entering St. Lucia. A negative COVID test 7 days or less before arrival was required, along with a mandatory quarantine period.
It monitors the vitals of quarantined persons who may be at high risk for developing COVID-19 disease.
Section 5 outlined measures for the electronic monitoring of persons contained at quarantine facilities or at home. Section 6 gave the Ministry of Health the ability to collect health information to provide the right type of care based on medical history. Section 7 empowered law enforcement to stop, detain, and arrest persons who contravene the measures outlined in the bill. Throughout this pandemic, the St. Lucia Labour Party's negative approach and lack of support for the COVID-19 response and attempts to sabotage the nation for maximum political mileage has been well documented. Even before the first case of the virus in St. Lucia, the SLP began mobilizing its soldiers to commence confrontation with law enforcement using the fear of the virus as grounds for protest.
This is insane. These are concerned citizens trying to educate persons,
There are a group of persons here. I came in here and I'm inquiring as to what's happening. They're distributing flies. So I'm trying to ascertain who is the leader of the group. That's all. There's nothing. Nobody has said anything. Hello? Nobody has said anything about breaking any law. Persons, I'm inquiring as to what is happening here.
When COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, the Prime Minister convened an urgent meeting to discuss the pandemic's possible impact on the island. Sean Edward, the second deputy of the St. Lucia Labour Party, was sent to represent the opposition. He praised the government for their swift response and organized approach.
Mine is not any technical pronouncement, but if anything, I just want to, on behalf of the parliamentary opposition, register our collective gratitude to the health team and everybody who constitutes NEMAC for the effort that is being made to get our country prepared in the event that we are confronted with a case. This morning has proven to be yet another reminder of the rich repository of talent that resides in this country. I mean, when I listened to the presentations made by Dr. Belma and her team, it's hard to imagine that there's anywhere else in the region where they can top this.
Days later, Philip Pierre undermines his own second deputy leader.
And right now, St Lucia is the worst prepared island for this virus in the region.
Philip Pierre misleads the nation and accuses the Prime Minister of being absent at an emergency CARICOM heads meeting. Even when the evidence showed the Prime Minister was in attendance, Philip Pierre never apologized for this blatant untruth.
The Prime Minister did not see it fit to attend a meeting to discuss this virus in Barbados. The Prime Minister did not go. He refused to go. All of the Prime Ministers went, but our Prime Minister did not see it fit for him to get on an aircraft and go to Barbados to discuss what could be one of the most serious issues facing our island.
The SLP repeatedly claimed that the state of emergency was implemented to infringe on the rights of St. Lucians.
These measures and these laws that we are doing today, that order is handled in the spirit in which we are agreeing to it. We hope that it's not used for any motives, because we know, Mr. Speaker, we know that in the best intentions in the world, there are some people who will use that opportunity to settle political points.
The state of emergency is a very serious set of powers to give a competent authority. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we want to give the people of St. Lucia the assurance that we will be extra vigilant to make sure that there are no abuses under the state of emergency. The Prime Minister has given the assurance in this House.
Together let us win this war. Be a soldier for St. Lucia.
St. Lucia hosted the National COVID-19 Response Telethon. The event raised over $2.5 million, which went directly towards assisting frontline workers, purchasing of the necessary personal protective equipment, assisting the poor and those severely affected by the pandemic.
We, the Shigani family, owners of SNS The Price Busters, recognize during these challenging times the value and importance of all the persons who are willingly putting themselves at risk. We therefore would like to pledge $100,000 to help support them.
Several organizations extended the support to the event. Noticeably absent was the St. Lucia Labour Party. In their defense, opposition leader Pierre stated that their absence was a result of them not being invited to lend support to the COVID-19 telethon. The Royal St. Lucia Police Force received word of an anti-Chasney protest organized by Richard Frederick, a man who has made it his life's mission to bring down the Chasney administration.
Until I see we get rid of Chasney and Philip J. Pierre is the next Prime Minister, I will not rest.
No formal application to hold this event was lodged. After intervention from the police, the motorcade was called off by the main organizer.
Sometimes we mess up, it's no fault of ours. But I always try my utmost to operate within the perimeters of the law.
However, the police were informed that the motorcade had left Castries and was headed down the west coast, despite non-approval at the behest of another individual.
The police are telling us how to do it because they have to do their job. So they're telling us how we can do it in smart. All we have to do is just do our thing in smart. You see, I'm not speaking on the speaker there. Tell everybody what I'm telling you, same speed. Okay? Because basically once you go out and we start making a big thing of it, then they're coming to arrest each of us, kind of a thing. And once we go in smart,
this character was arrested on suspicion of leading an unlawful protest. Rather than condemn this unlawful act, The SLP called for his immediate release on grounds that his detainment reflected a deliberate attempt by the authorities to muzzle and intimidate a journalist.
The guardians of democracy, I hope the people in the United States, I hope the Americans, I hope the Europeans are viewing what is happening to St. Lucia's democracy. And I hope members of the press, members of Amnesty International, and members of the world's free press are observing.
It is generally accepted that in a time of crisis, all political organizations should put the best interest of the people first, working together to find solutions to issues which can bring reprieve to every St. Lucian, regardless of political affiliation. Though invited to all, the SLP only attended one meeting of the Economic Strategy Response Team, yet used airtime for political mileage during a crisis.
I'm sure I'm one of the persons that Mr. Shari will be able to identify, and the fact that Mr. Shari has made this statement is put it in the public domain, it almost sounds threatening. And further, there's been rumors have been circulating throughout, and in St. Lucia, you know, there is no smoke without fire.
Philip Pierre announced that as soon as the state of emergency comes to an end, the SLP will hold a massive protest rally. This despite the fact that the country was still battling a highly contagious virus.
We'll be writing to the police to seek permission to hold a peaceful protest during the first week of October. We urge all St. Lucians to prepare to participate.
The opposition worked tirelessly to prevent the passing of the COVID-19 Prevention and Control Bill. They walked out of the House during a critical debate on the bill, and further dialogue was halted due to their continued absence in both the upper and lower house. Yet, they were quick to shout draconian leadership, stating that the bill was passed without consultation. The SLP used this to stage a public march on October the 4th, inciting St. Lucians against the Chasney administration.
I am in the thick of the crowd of the protests, moving towards the market steps, where persons will then reward the political leader and the rest of the SLP administration.
Complacency mixed with the SLP protest was about to take St. Lucia from the best case scenario of 0 active cases in country to a mounting death toll. Placard-bearing protesters did not maintain distancing protocols, and many were maskless. The congregation of Labour Party supporters and the breach of protocols during the pandemic showed a lack of due care and attention to the detrimental effects of the COVID-19 pandemic globally, regionally, and locally. Up until this March, St. Lucia had been doing well with 28 combined cases and no deaths. 6 days after the march, our hopes and dreams for normalcy were shattered by a bus driver who, it is alleged, participated in the SLP march and tested positive for the virus.
Case number 40 is a 42-year-old male from the Miku district.
This necessitated contact tracing of over 500 persons, conducting 283 tests and quarantining of over 50 people in government-funded facilities. By the 22nd of October, there were 42 new cases, which indicated the presence of community spread.
Rethink the policy on opening the country's borders.
The Labour Party's PR machinery wasted no time in passing the blame onto incoming visitors. However, the data from the Ministry of Health showed that only one returning national tested positive for COVID-19 in October. Their attempts at sabotaging the government undermined the efforts of the CMO and all frontline workers who slaved tirelessly to keep the spread of COVID-19 to a minimal. The CMO was discredited by the opposition on accusations that she was more loyal to Alan Chasney than her oath of office, as evident of her support of the reopening of the tourism sector to US travelers. In the month which followed the SLP march, community spread tripled to 164 locals, whereas 15 visitors tested positive on entry. It was generally suspected that oversights in maritime border controls were the culprits for the new spikes in cases, as persons entering the country illegally from Martinique, which at the time had over 3,500 active cases.
And we are learning that people from Martinique, which is a country that is infected with the coronavirus, are infiltrating the country through the back door. And that the Louvet Beach, which is not too far away from Olio in my constituency, is one of the entry points for those persons in Martinique. Ever since the demise of our banana industry, a lot of people from my constituency have resorted to a life in Martinique where they work very odd jobs, Mr. Speaker, to earn a living for themselves. And with all the panic that has been triggered by COVID-19 coronavirus, some of them are fleeing from Martinique and they are finding very creative means to enter. Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity in this Honorable House today to appeal to all my constituents and St Lucians who have relatives in Martinique, who know that they are planning to enter the country through the back door, to let them know that they need to desist from doing it.
Therefore, new measures were put in place with regard to border control. One such measure was the suspension of licenses for fishermen for 7 days, while the Marine Unit beefed up its surveillance of our borders.
The state, it's no secret, by itself cannot manage the borders by ourselves. And the fisher folk need to act as part of our security force.
Once again, instead of supporting this measure in the interest of St Lucia, Philip Pierre was at it again.
A lengthy press release by the St Lucia Labour Party captioned, quote, "Do not punish fisherfolk to fit your false narrative," unquote, reads, quote, "Although the Prime Minister's action against the fishers is being labelled as a border control measure, it seems to be motivated instead by the need to maintain the backdoor blame narrative for the recent spike in COVID-19 cases, as this deflects away from the inadequacies of front door protocols. It is telling that one certified accommodation property has since recorded 7 cases of COVID-19 and that this hotel has not been shut for any length of time yet. Instead, fishers, none of whom have tested positive for COVID-19, are being asked to stop their business operations," unquote. The concerns of the opposition were brought before Prime Minister Alan Chasney.
Almost immediately, the Labour Party's rumour mill circulated that there was an outbreak of COVID-19 at a Sandals resort. The opposition leader perpetuated the spread of this false information. These baseless accusations were quickly put to rest by a press release from the hotel which stated, "It is noteworthy that as of October 30th, there was no data to suggest that any of the 6,000 visitors since the opening of St. Lucia's borders were responsible for the community spread of COVID-19. By October 16th, schools were closed. Then, the curfew was extended. Work from home was ordered and social gatherings were discouraged. In a last-ditch effort, the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce mounted the Recover St. Lucia campaign to help rally citizens, companies and communities to accelerate recovery from the economic and health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This initiative was driven by the need to apply innovative and adaptive responses to living and doing business in the new normal. Still to come, the CMO dominates TV screens, patients escape quarantine, and bus drivers go on strike. The coming of the second, more deadly wave of COVID-19 was long predicted.
So I'm warning you,
Next week, you may hear something new about COVID. Next week, you may hear something about COVID because we held our match this afternoon. When they come sooner than later and say something about COVID, you will know that they are lying and they are not speaking the truth as usual, my brothers and sisters.
Politicians downplayed it. The population naturally seemed eager to return to normalcy. But little did we know, death, massive spikes in cases, and an economy in a comatose state would punctuate November.
Today, Sunday, November 1st, 2020, the Ministry of Health received confirmation of 6 new cases. Today, Wednesday, November 4th, 2020, the Ministry of Health and Wellness received confirmation of 13 new cases of the Ministry of Health and Wellness received confirmation of 10 November 12th, 2020. The Ministry of Health total number of cases today, Sunday, November 20th, now totals 140. Health and Wellness.
On average, 6 people were diagnosed with COVID every day in that month, with a total of 179 cases and the first 2 related deaths. The spikes occurred while the government was in the final stages of rehabilitation of the Victoria Hospital into a full-fledged respiratory facility. Engineers and workmen labored around the clock to ensure that this facility was fully commissioned to deal with the second wave. Unfortunately, no number of preventive actions and investment in healthcare would slow the spread unless and until citizens made drastic behavioral changes. At the height of community spread, the police shut down 20 bars in Castries because they allowed patrons to socialize and consume alcohol on their premises. As the cases continued to rise, the Ministry of Health and Wellness introduced more stringent COVID-19 protocols to break the cycle of transmission. This included suspension of all social gatherings, businesses closing by 9 p.m. and bars by 4 p.m., combined with stay-at-home orders. 200 wardens were hired to aid the police with enforcement of COVID-19 protocols. Due to the alarming increase in cases, the Turning Point Rehabilitation Center was now being used as a temporary respiratory facility. To address the problem of food security brought on by the pandemic, the Department of Agriculture, in collaboration with the St Lucia Marketing Board and the Taiwan Technical Mission, assisted farmers to ensure the consistent supply of produce for the country. Under this initiative, farmers were issued 6-month contracts during which they were required to sell at least $5,000 worth of produce to the marketing board in order to have their contracts renewed. Farmers were also provided with incentives such as fertilizer and ground cover. Fishers also benefited from a one-time grant of $500 from the government to reduce the impact faced by the fishing sector. That month, St Lucia welcomed back Air Canada. 4 additional flights from the United States and Canada brought 725 visitors and returning nationals to a familiar backdrop where they were met with a full complement of protocols such as a fully staffed nurse station for testing, sanitation stations, and thermal scanners. As part of its responsible reopening, guests were only offered accommodation at COVID-19 certified hotels. Hotels jumped at the opportunity to fill their rooms. Bay Gardens Resort offered travelers 15% off lodging and promised a safe, warm holiday, free from the stress of the ongoing pandemic. In November, the St Lucia Medical and Dental Association beckoned for an extension in home quarantine for patients who tested positive and those who had been exposed. This, they believe, would be a relief valve for the overstressed respiratory facility.
Our Chief Medical Officer, the rest of the officials at the Ministry of Health certainly are on board with the concept of telemedicine, that we certainly have to do more of that, if only to limit contact.
A stringent list of requirements was put in place for home quarantine. tracking devices were attached to the returnees, and a level of trust was offered to those applying. However, for many a home quarantine subject, the need to socialize overrode the need for public safety. And then came the problems.
That those persons are going to be called in and spoken to, and if you're not keeping to your promise to stay home, then action will be taken against you.
They have bans, and the numbers that they give us to contact them, we are trying our best to get through to them, and even sending out word that, you know, should anybody come into contact with these persons, we are doing that individually, and we are not succeeding. It's getting to the point where, you know, it's becoming very risky to just have these people out there.
By December 2020, our neighbors were facing similar difficulties with COVID. In Jamaica, entire parishes had to be placed on lockdown.
Coronavirus cases climbing in Jamaica. A COVID response worker and about 52 Alorca call center workers are among them. The permanent secretary in the health ministry is in quarantine and the building is being sanitized. St. Catherine under lockdown. The Prime Minister is pleading for people to stop movement.
Tan at your yard.
In Barbados, breaches in protocol caused alarming spikes in cases and the spread of the virus into the Barbados prison.
The COVID-19 outbreak at Her Majesty's Prison Dodds will be brought under control within another 2 weeks. That's the view of Dr. Carl Ward, who was acting as a public health liaison officer at the St. Philip Penal Institution. During a press conference this afternoon, Dr. Ward revealed that of the 790 inmates at HMP Dodds, 240 of them, all males, along with 72 staff members, have so far tested positive for COVID-19.
Trinidad's borders remain closed since March 2020, yet COVID figures continued to rise exponentially. Dominica, St. Vincent and Grenada, though affected by the virus, were able to keep their numbers low. St. Lucia was a forerunner in COVID protocol implementation throughout the region, with nearly all countries subsequently implementing 24-hour curfews, restriction on the sale of alcohol, restriction in movement, work from home and school closures. Amazingly, depending on the maturity of the opposition in some countries, these measures were either wholeheartedly adopted in the interest of the people or vehemently opposed for maximum political mileage. All countries within CARICOM implemented some stimulus package and borrowed millions from the IMF and World Bank to keep their economies afloat. Barbados, Grenada, Dominica, Jamaica and St. Kitts all rolled out extensive stimulus packages with borrowed funds, as did St. Lucia. By December 2020, the electorate in the neighboring islands all spoke the same language with their index finger. In the midst of a pandemic, Jamaicans returned the JLP to power with a more resounding mandate. In St. Kitts and Nevis, Team Unity, headed by Dr. Timothy Harris, enjoyed a landslide victory, winning 9 of the 11 seats. Dr. Keith Rowley, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, had been criticized and vilified by his political opponent over his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and his stringent measures of containment. Their elections were held in the middle of the pandemic and community spread. Dr. Rowley and the PNM were re-elected to continue the management of that country during these unprecedented times. St. Vincent and the Grenadines also went to the polls. They held mass rallies, hardly anyone wore masks, and the administration was judged on its time in office and its handling of the greatest political campaign topic of our time, COVID. Vincentians once again ensured that the incumbent, the 5-star general, was returned to continue with the management of the country and the COVID pandemic. St. Lucia is perhaps the next CARICOM country to head to the polls. They say hindsight is 20/20. If only the last month in 2020 could have offered St. Lucians hindsight. It was a month with the thickest, most obvious writing on the wall. yet thousands would go about their daily lives seemingly uncaringly, albeit obviously ignoring the health hazards. By December 1st, the CDC had reissued a Level 3 COVID-19 alert for St. Lucia, discouraging non-essential travel to the island. To date, St. Lucia had recorded 138 recoveries with 119 active cases. And things were about to get much worse. Minibus drivers, led by the Southern Minibus Association, waged strike action on several routes to protest COVID-19 limits on passenger capacity. Drivers argued that the restrictions were causing substantial losses. Therefore, they demanded compensation from government. The president of the Minibus Association, Philip Jean-Baptiste, was fired by members for stating publicly that the strike was politically motivated. 3 questions became obvious. 1. Was the strike politically motivated? 2. Weren't minibus operators offered 100% duty waiver on new and used buses as a means of compensation for the impact which COVID was wreaking on their sector? And 3. Did minibus operators fully comprehend that packed buses could be a conduit for community transmission? December was also a peculiar month as the island recorded confidence from the international market, which signaled that despite the troubles in the world, tourists longed to be on our shores and returning nationals missed home. St. Lucia was named 2020 World's Leading Honeymoon Destination.
It is an honor for St. Lucia to be named for a 12th time as the world's leading honeymoon destination.
And #1 Caribbean destination in 2020's Reader's Choice Award. Arrivals increased by 50% over November. Nearly all hotels which were being used as quarantine facilities were now fully booked with tourists. Health authorities also placed a nominal fee for government quarantine. And now, home quarantine was approved by the Ministry of Health. Unfortunately, this would be extremely difficult to police. 16 returning nationals and 19 tourists turned out to be positive, and 59 locals shared the virus that month. Social interactions, the incubation period mixed with the festive season, was creating a lethal cocktail for our health sector. The UK variant SARS-CoV-2 also became a threat in December. The government, in response, enforced stricter travel guidelines as it geared up for peak winter season. NEMAC approved updated COVID-19 restrictions from December 15th to January 11th, 2021. Extensions of business hours, in-dining and gatherings of up to 25 persons were permitted. However, no Christmas or New Year's parties and absolutely no fireworks or Asu Square celebrations were permitted. Yet, there were many who defied the rules, and the country would pay for it dearly in January 2021. When we return, politics erodes common sense. The vaccine arrives, and Sarah Flood is outraged. The ominous writing was on the wall since the commencement of the festive season. Though relaxing some of the protocols due to a stabilization in the transmission rate, the CMO, police, and Prime Minister reminded citizens to curtail their interactions during the holidays. The CMO warned of the repercussions of non-adherence.
The biggest problem we saw during December was not the change in the policies because they were still restrictive. They still allowed very small groups. There are certain things that we stopped to reduce the crowding, like the fireworks, etc. We cancelled all staff parties and all activities. We stopped a lot of the social activities associated with the season. But what we noted, which put us at great risk during the month of December, was the non-adherence to home quarantine and the non-adherence to these very same policies.
The incubation period of COVID-19 is 14 days, and almost like clockwork, the epidemiological graph reported acute non-adherence and an astronomical rise in community spread. Between January 1st to 14th, 190 cases were reported. Between the 14th to the 31st of January, things went from bad to mad. There were 842 cases in total for January. St Lucia now had the highest COVID rate within the OECS and second only to Barbados, which recorded 1,162 new cases in January. Everyone was pointing a finger. The CMO attributed it to non-adherence to protocols. The UWPs said it was the famous New Year's party at Cap Estate. Others laid the blame on an open border and thousands of tourists, while a few mentioned that returning nationals were more interested in house to house than being in quarantine. And naturally, Philippe Pierre and his group laid all the blame on Chasney. Whatever the real reasons, the consequences were far-reaching and economically and socially debilitating. COVID was present in both primary and secondary schools, forcing an island-wide suspension. The Royalton Resort closed its doors after several staff and guests tested positive. The Center for Disease Control issued a Level 4 advisory on St. Lucia, urging travelers to stay clear of the destination. By January 25th, there were 5 cases of the British variant SARS-CoV-2. 8 patients succumbed to the virus in January, and once again, the leader of the opposition called for the firing of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. As at January 11, 2021, taxi operators, hotel workers, and ancillary services were now gainfully re-employed because of the decision to manage the entry of tourists. The Civil Service Association called for a 2-week island-wide shutdown. The St. Lucia Medical and Dental Association requested the instituting of curfews from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and the use of rapid testing. But it was the Royal St. Lucia Police Force and the St. Lucia Fire Service that would be taxed the most this month, dealing with quarantine breakers. January was a depressing month for most St. Lucians. WhatsApp messages with the daily count scared us, reaffirmed the need for social distancing, and we watched helplessly as all the initiatives prepared by the government began to burst at the seams.
Yeah, no COVID again.
The newly refurbished Victoria Hospital Respiratory Facility was hemorrhaging with new cases. The number of tests being conducted daily amplified, and understandably, the wait time for results increased significantly. The problems of exposure, non-diagnosis, non-isolation, and non-adherence to protocols made the next wave of stricter movement measures an easier pill to swallow. By January 22, 2021, the Prime Minister announced suspension on alcohol sales, curfews from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., prohibition on all social gatherings, and closure of all schools. The opposition called these moves discriminatory.
The restrictions on sale of alcohol is discriminatory to locals. Visitors can have access to alcohol and are free to socialize, whilst locals are denied even private purchases.
The story of St. Lucia versus COVID is written by every St. Lucian. Let us examine our individual actions to see what part we played, whether we became infected or not. How did we contribute to the stupendous increase in cases? How often did we break the protocols, had friends over, took a chance and went to that party or social activity? Did we promote closing of the borders and forgot how many families depend on the tourism dollar? Did we go see that friend who was supposed to be in isolation? Or did we go to work with symptoms of the flu while denying the possibility of our exposure? Or were our demands on the central purse greater than our contribution to the consolidated fund? Were we mobilized into action by political motives rather than national interest? And did we believe talk show hosts before medical professionals during this pandemic? None of us is without blame, and it is our inherent and cultivated biases which will determine whether St. Lucia's infection rate soars or plummets. By February 17th, the infection rate had dropped by 50% globally. In February 2021, Alan Chasney offered some hope. In Barbados and Dominica, long lines of people waited for hours to be immunized. The prime ministers and opposition leaders in those countries welcomed the AstraZeneca vaccine and promoted it in the interest of their people. Vaccination trepidations were no different in St. Lucia. Alan Chasney led by example. We Can, We Will was the theme for Independence 42, and it was celebrated virtually. Novel, fresh, educational, nostalgic, and the Prime Minister's playlist made young and old gyrate.
Wake up to the sunrise with a heart of gold, see the sunshine, a place where there's only harmony and unity. I know that it's the only place for me, yeah.
Think happy, don't stress, don't rush, don't worry. Don't worry, cause I got music for your soul, music for your heart, music that clean and not slack. Let's elevate.
Greetings to all St. Lucians in the diaspora, wherever you may be. And happy 42nd Independence Anniversary.
It was a testament of a people who had a year to adapt to the new normal, a realization that central government did care about healthcare, the economy, infrastructure, community development, and Independence 42 was a time to celebrate it all, albeit virtually. But as soon as the festivities were over, the once quiet government MPs got on their feet in the House of Assembly to set the record straight.
COVID descended upon us with 3 hospitals, our main institutions, in transition. And what did this government have to do? While keeping the spread of COVID down, what did we have to do? Work on all these 3 institutions to ensure that we were able to get them to a state where we could maintain, sustain the level of care whilst at the same time managing COVID. This is what the Minister of Health inherited. This is what the former administration left for the Minister of Health, and they have the call to come here and say that she's performing so poorly. She has performed excellently and credibly in the circumstances.
Every opposition wants to govern. Every action of the opposition is to show the incompetencies of a sitting government and to offer themselves as the saviors. If a country is progressing economically and socially, it is bad news for the opposition party. There is opposition in every crisis, and COVID is the blood in the water for circling sharks. It is in the SLP's best interest for the healthcare system to crash, for the number of cases to rise exponentially, for schools to remain closed, and for hotel workers to be on the breadline, thus increasing the likelihood of their ascension into office. This has certainly been the hardest office to manage. The Prime Minister of St Lucia is but a servant of the people, who is advised by the technocrats and stakeholders in every sector. History will record his actions, which brought relief to thousands, his economic recovery and resilience programs, which are still being instituted, his formula of remaining steadfast to capital projects which were already in the pipeline to further spur economic development and employment. It is in this time of crisis that Alan Chasney should be judged. And like nearly every other country in the region which went to the polls in 2020, St. Lucians are aware of the crisis facing the world. St. Lucians know the sequence of events and how their elected government navigated turbulent waters to manage this crisis. And this crisis is not over. Time, effective leadership, a caring government, and a progressive people will determine whether Helen can fight this infection and regain social, medical, and economic stability for her 180,000 children in the ongoing fight between St. Lucia versus COVID-19.
Never been told.